Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, I thought that we would review this little video today by this one channel named Dante's Boxing Nation. And the reason why I wanted to review it is because I just found this video interesting when it came down to it. And I do end up reviewing his channel quite a bit too. Like I said, I see a lot of double standards and, a lot of bias when it comes to these LDBC and new media channels. One of the fighters that they've been really trying to push for the past I don't know how many years, especially to tear down Canelo Alvarez's name, especially in recent years, they've been using Jermall Charlo's and Demetrius Andrade's name to try and tear down Canelo Alvarez whenever they want to, because they don't want to fight it like Canelo Alvarez as the number one pound for pound guy. Because they look at Canelo Alvarez as a European, they look at him overall as a Caucasian Hispanic, and they just can't have someone like that overall at the number one pound for pound spot. So it is what it is. Anyways, what a lot of these guys have been saying for a very long time, which I've always kind of countered against, and I'm not sure how many of these guys, when it comes to these channels, actually believe in what they're saying. I personally believe that really a lot of them, when it comes down to it, more than likely are probably full of hot air. Meaning overall that a lot of the shit that they say, I don't think that they actually truly believe it. Because if you know boxing, I don't know how you take a look at Canelo Alvarez at this point in time in his career and then take a look at Jermall Charlo and say, wow, that dude really is going to have a real possibility of beating Canelo Alvarez. That's not me saying overall that he has no chance. That's not me saying overall that that's not a great fight. But when I take a look at Jermall Charlo versus Canelo Alvarez, I give Jermall Charlo about a 20% chance. That's even less of a chance than what I gave Billy Joe Saunders. Billy Joe Saunders, because of how somewhat slick he can be at least, and how hard he can be to catch in certain areas, I gave him about a 30% chance, which is still not that high of a percentage. But I just don't see Charlo beating Canelo, man. That's just my personal opinion. And to be quite honest with you, I don't know if a certain amount of the Jermall Charlo supporters, especially after this fight, now see Canelo Alvarez getting beat by Jermall Charlo. In fact, to be quite honest with you, I'm not sure if any of these channels once upon a time saw Jermall Charlo beating Canelo Alvarez, because the type of energy that Dante has in this video, I thought was very interesting, because all of a sudden, Jermall Charlo, he has a little bit of an off performance against Juan Montiel. Now, when I say off performance, I'm talking about a performance overall to where Charlo, I think, made some mistakes overall that maybe he should have not made when it came down to it. I think maybe he was going for the knockout a little bit too much. I think overall that Jermall Charlo, I think that he was just doing some incorrect things. But I even said that in my review. I believe that if Jermall Charlo in the future, I believe overall he is going to be sharper and that he is going to be a better version of himself. But after this fight, Dante, it almost seemed like he seemed to lose complete confidence in Jermall Charlo and possibly beating Canelo Alvarez, at least overall to a certain degree, which is something I found interesting, because if you truly believe that Jermall Charlo is the creme de la creme of boxing, and you believe overall that he's on that same level of Canelo Alvarez, at least this is what you say when it comes down to it, I wouldn't be basically convinced just off of one little bad performance that, he would have no chance against Canelo Alvarez, or that overall all of a sudden he's just this new and changed fighter. But you're going to see what Dante says overall, that all of a sudden he does not have the same confidence anymore as what he used to, which makes me wonder, did Dante really ever have this type of confidence in a Jermall Charlo, or was he just using his name to tear down Canelo Alvarez all along? If I had to guess, it probably would be the latter. But we'll see what happens. Anyways, let's see what Dante has to say. I'm going to tune in a little bit here and there. Should be very interesting.
Each and every round, hard as he could, I could tell in his eyes that, he was a true warrior from the beginning, and he wanted to fight. It don't matter what I hit him with, he come on. I love that spirit. And man, he gonna be great, man. Dante's Boxing Nation, what's going on, guys? Boy, I tell you, this year is full of surprises, ain't it? Jermall Charlo goes the distance with Montiel in what was a very entertaining, competitive fight. Very competitive fight, surprisingly. Now, you got to give Montiel a lot of credit. Even though Charlo won almost every single round, he won by unanimous decision. But, the crazy thing is, even though Montiel lost almost every round in this fight, you could say that he actually hit Jermall Charlo more than any other fighter had ever hit Jermall Charlo. I mean,
I'm not so sure about that. Austin Trout and Matt Korobov might have something to say about that. Anyway.
Recently there's been so many fights where the underdog, who is perceived to have no chance going into the fight, ends up putting up a hell of a fight, surprising everyone. Which is one of the reasons why I was really disappointed we didn't get to see the Teofimo Lopez versus Kambosos fight. That was the main fight I wanted to see this weekend because I felt it would be the most competitive. And if Lopez were able to beat Kambosos, then that would most likely set up a Lopez versus Devin Haney fight because of all of the money that DAZN was going to offer Teofimo Lopez. So once again, I thought that fight was going to be the most competitive. And the reason why I wasn't that crazy about watching the Charlo Montiel fight is because I thought this would be the least competitive. Turned out to be the contrary. This was the most competitive fight this weekend. But once again, you got to give Montiel a lot of credit. Because for those of you guys who don't know, he was knocked out by Jaime Munguia. And I believe it was in the first round, but that was at 147, right? Now, so going into this fight, most fans would automatically assume, man, if he got knocked out by Jaime Munguia, then this is going to be a first-round knockout for Jermall Charlo, right? But this is the thing.
Well, I didn't think it was going to be a first-round knockout because Jermall Charlo, once again, and I've said this for many years because I know what I'm watching when it comes to Jermall Charlo because I've been watching him for many years, pretty much ever since he's been on the come-up. If you know anything about Jermall Charlo and also his, lighter brother, Jermall Charlo, meaning the one in the lighter weight class, they do have similar faults. And on top of that, Jermall Charlo, he does have very decent power when it comes down to it, but he's not someone who has A-plus power. He's not someone who has that Canelo-type power. He's not someone overall who has that Gennady Golovkin-type power. So was I surprised overall that he just wasn't able to go in there and knock him out with one shot? I'm not surprised at all because, once again, Jermall Charlo, he's a very decent puncher, but you can debate that he's not an A-grade puncher. Once again, he's a very decent puncher, but he's not someone overall, who's just going to go in there against elite caliber opponents and usually knock him out with one shot. Now, he was able to do that against Julian J. Rock Williams, but Julian J. Rock Williams, even for how skilled he is, he does have his certain faults. He also has a chin made out of a wet paper towel. So it is what it is. Anyway.
Think about being knocked out. When fighters get knocked out for the first time, they either become better or they become worse. They either learn from being knocked out or, they always end up getting knocked out after that. All of a sudden now they just have that soft spot on their chin to where every time someone touches it, they instantly drop. For example, fighters like James Kirkland comes to mind.
There's certain fighters overall that may learn in certain fights from getting knocked out. There's also certain fighters overall that may look good in certain fights and may not get knocked out. And there's, then they may go to other performances and they may get completely upset and knocked out. Let's actually once again bring up J. Rock Williams. J. Rock Williams was a guy that got knocked out by Jermall Charlo. That to this day is still Jermall Charlo's best win of his career. Then he goes in against Jarrett Hurd, probably as an underdog, because Jarrett Hurd was the unified champion at that time. And overall, he goes in there, completely dominates Jarrett Hurd, which it was only a matter of time before that was going to happen because Jarrett Hurd overall is not an A-class skilled boxer when it comes down to it. He really relied a lot on his size for his advantage in that weight division. And he finally went in there with a decently skilled boxer, someone who had much better craft than he did, and he got his ass whooped. Because J. Rock Williams, he actually did the right thing. He smothered Jarrett Hurd, fought him a lot on the inside, and J. Rock Williams also does have decent power and a decent skill set, and he really was able to beat the hell out of Jarrett Hurd. But then, fast forward a couple fights later, he gets knocked out by this one random dude, I believe, named Jason Rosario. So, once again, when it comes down to it, you have certain fighters overall that, some may learn when they get knocked out, but they also may have always a chance of getting knocked out because they just may be a little bit chinny. Certain fighters overall, like an Amir Khan, when it comes down to it. But when it comes to Juan Montiel, he is one of those fighters overall that I do believe did learn maybe from getting knocked out. You could debate that. Let me also say this about Juan Montiel. Juan Montiel is one of the most awkward boxers that I've personally ever seen. I mean, you want to talk about a dude that has a C-class skill set. This dude has a very, very marginal boxing skill set, very little amount of boxing skills in the ring, very little amount of boxing skills.
Amir Khan comes to mind. You know, the first time these guys got knocked out, they were never the same. Roy Jones, right? But then you have other fighters like Tevin Farmer, you know, who got knocked out.
I agree that Amir Khan was, well, I'm not going to say that Amir Khan was never the same after he got knocked out the first time in his career by Breedis Prescott, because then later on he was thought to be the top of that 140-pound division until Danny Garcia got a hold of him and knocked him out. And then, of course, Amir Khan, he was pretty much done after he got knocked out by Canelo Alvarez. But it's just funny to me how these channels, these LDBC new media channels, the ones that like Terrence Crawford, for example, they'll try to argue that Terrence Crawford, that he beat a good version of Amir Khan and that he beat a good version of Kell Brook, even though those fighters were completely washed up and were leftovers. But when Vasily Lomachenko, when he was ranked number one pound for pound, what did Aki TV and a certain amount of these other channels say? Oh, well, Vasily Lomachenko, he's fighting Mikey Garcia leftovers and guys that are coming off of draws, just being completely disingenuous. But, once again, it's very interesting what type of narrative they try to promote when it comes to a fighter that they tend to like and that they're trying to push versus a fighter overall that they tend not to like and that they're trying to tear down. Very interesting.
And came back better. Manny Pacquiao came back better. And there's many other fighters like that. They came back better. Terry Norris, the great Terry.
Danny Jacobs also was another fighter overall that ended up getting knocked out in his career, I believe, by that one Russian fighter named Pirog. Unfortunately, he ended up retiring, I believe, because of a back injury. There's another fighter, Danny Jacobs overall, who retired, overall came back as a better fighter. But what did they say about Canelo Alvarez when he fought Danny Jacobs, who was a clear A-class fighter when Canelo fought him? What did they say? Oh, well, Canelo Alvarez, he only fights guys, that already have losses on their records. But then Devin Haney recently, who fought Jorge Linares, who you could certainly argue was Vasily Lomachenko's leftovers and somebody else's leftovers, because at that point, Jorge Linares, it wasn't even the fact that he had gotten knocked out multiple times in his career. It was the fact that he had lost 2 out of his past 5 fights by knockout. Now, that's something overall to where you can say he was leftovers. But what did Dante and Aki TV say? They said, well, Jorge Linares, he even said that he was in the best conditioning of his life. Now, had that been Canelo Alvarez fighting a similar type of opponent, you know what they would have said? They would have said overall that Canelo Alvarez, here he goes again, facing low-tier competition, facing a guy that's lost in the past. That's what they would say. So once again, it's just interesting because they're so blatantly biased with whatever fighters they're trying to push versus the fighters they're not trying to push. And that's what I'm saying. I'm not sure if these guys actually 100% believe what they say. Because some of the narratives overall that they try to push are so blatantly obviously biased when it comes down to that. It's just really to the point of ridiculousness. But it is what it is. Anyway.
Norris had got knocked out in a vicious way. Came back to become pound for pound the best fighter in the world. So, people respond to being knocked out differently. And I think Montiel, he learned from being knocked out. Because a lot of people didn't really pay attention to it probably. But in this fight, Charlo was throwing a number of punches. In fact, I think they said he broke a record for how many punches he threw in this fight. But believe it or not, he was missing a lot of those punches he was throwing. And for some reason, Charlo didn't look nowhere near the same. He didn't look like Charlo in this fight. I don't know if it's the long layoff. I don't know. Or it could possibly be the fact that Montiel...
I'm not going to say overall that he didn't look like Jermall Charlo, because Jermall Charlo in the past has suffered some struggling rounds against low-tier competition. A lot of the same faults that I've always seen with Jermall Charlo: not A-grade head movement, not A-grade foot speed, sometimes relying a little bit too much on his counterpunching ability when it's not, debatably A-class when it comes down to, well, you can say that it's A-class, it's just not on the same level as some of the other great counterpunchers, like a Canelo Alvarez. It's not on that level. This is why I say Jermall Charlo, he's a bigger version of Danny Garcia. They're very, very similar when it comes down to it. Both of them rely on their counterpunching ability a little bit too much when it comes down to it. Sometimes their foot speed, even though their footwork is not bad, it can be a little bit slow. Their foot speed can be a little bit slow. They don't have A-grade head movement, and sometimes they have a problem with not letting their hands go. And Jermall Charlo, when he did let his hands go a certain amount of times in this fight, now maybe he did a little bit too much. Maybe he was trying to go for the knockout a little bit too much in the first half of the fight, and that's why he got tired out in the second half of the fight. Personally, I think that's probably what happened. But who knows? Maybe Jermall Charlo, maybe he doesn't usually let his hands go as much because maybe he can't. Maybe overall he does have stamina issues. We'll see what happens in the future.
Was sneaking in body shots, and he started to walk forward, and maybe he was walking down Charlo a little bit. I don't know which one it is, but this didn't look like Jermall Charlo. Just like coincidentally.
Well, I think that this looked a little bit like Jermall Charlo, just a Charlo overall that did not impose his best game plan possible. I think overall that's what this was. But when it comes down to it, am I surprised with all the problems that I've seen with Jermall Charlo in this fight? Not at all. Because Jermall Charlo, once again, all the faults that I see with him, he is a very talented boxer. Don't get it twisted. He is an A-grade boxer when it comes down to it. But he's an A-grade boxer the same way that Danny Garcia is an A-grade boxer. You know, he'll probably look very good against you, or he'll probably beat you overall, you know, if you're, you know, a solid B-class fighter, even maybe if you're A- fighter. He may even beat you then. But he's probably not going to beat you if you're an A to A+ fighter. But it's so hard to judge that with Jermall Charlo once again. That's just personally my opinion. Some people may disagree. But when it comes down to it, like I said, that's personally my opinion. But it's so hard to judge that because Jermall Charlo, he really has not faced any great names in his career. At least not that many. Now, of course, I'm going to get a lot of people that disagree with that. They're going to point out J-Rock Williams. They're going to point out Austin Trout. They're going to point out Sergey Derevyanchenko. None of those fighters are A-class fighters. Absolutely none of them. You know, J-Rock, Julian Williams, he's not an A-class fighter. That's been proven, all right? He's suffered a couple of losses in his career, not just to Jermall Charlo, okay? When you talk about Sergey Derevyanchenko, you're talking about a guy that's lost every big fight in his career, all right? Ended up losing to Gennady Golovkin, Danny Jacobs, all those boys. All right? It is what it is. Now, of course, the Gennady Golovkin one a lot of people thought was controversial. I'd have to rewatch that fight. It was pretty decently close for me, but I understand why a lot of people, of course, thought Sergey Derevyanchenko won that fight, but I'd have to rewatch it. I don't remember my exact scorecard. But when it comes down to it overall, like I said, Jermall Charlo, it's not like he has the worst resume out there, but he certainly doesn't have an A-grade resume. You know, it is what it is. Like I said, in my opinion, if Jermall Charlo, if he would have fought some of these guys, if he actually would have been serious about fighting some of these elite guys as he claims to be, like a Demetrius Andrade, like a Billy Joe Saunders, a Caleb Plant, or a David Benavidez, I'm not sure if Jermall Charlo beats any of those guys, man. I'm not sure if he beats any of those guys. Not a one. Maybe he would beat a couple of them, but I'm not so sure.
You know, the last Andrade fight didn't really look that much like Andrade. And that's why I tell you guys, this year is full of surprises. We've seen so many, you know, A-level fighters or B-level fighters that were in there with underdogs and did not look like themselves. Or maybe they got hurt for the first time, like Devin Haney did. But that's different because Devin was stepping up in competition. You know, these guys are fighting underdogs, real underdogs, you know. So, yeah, there's been a lot of surprises this year. And, yeah, I mean, Jermall Charlo, he didn't look anything like Jermall Charlo. He was getting hit too much, you know.
Well, that means overall that he was exactly like Jermall Charlo. Because Jermall Charlo, in every single fight that he's in, actually does get hit a little bit too much. That means that you don't really know what you're watching when it comes down to it. Because, once again, if you watch a Jermall Charlo fight, you know, even sometimes against B and C grade competition, which is all he's faced in his career. But when it comes down to the overall, even if you take a look at Jermall Charlo in those fights, he does get hit entirely way too much. He is a little bit too straightforward. He does not have a great head movement. All right, he will get hit by a certain amount of shots, especially the jab. All right, it is what it is.
The way his head was getting snapped back every time he got hit, you know, it just didn't look like him. It just didn't look like.
Well, you should watch Jermall Charlo more, not through rose-colored glasses, because then that means you have no idea what the hell you're talking about. That's what that means. Because once again, I've been watching Jermall Charlo for years. You don't even have to watch him for years. You can just watch him in a couple of even in some of his bigger fights. Like when he was very impressive against Derevyanchenko. You can even see it there. Jermall Charlo, he's never had A-grade head movement. He just does not have it.
And I don't know how much we have to attribute.
This is why I keep saying overall, when people come at me, when I keep saying these points, where Jermall Charlo, you have these channels overall like Aki TV and Dante's Boxing Nation. They try to convince you, or they try to spread this narrative, whether they believe it or not. They try to spread this narrative that Jermall Charlo and Demetrius Andrade, that, you know, they're better than any of the other fighters that Canelo Alvarez is fighting, is just because they're, you know, Black American champions. You know, and that, you know, we can take a look at that on the surface, and we can say overall that, you know, usually Black American champions, that usually they're some of the most dominant fighters in the sport. But that doesn't mean that every Black American champion is going to be this slickster. And when we take a look at Jermall Charlo, he's just not on that level. People try to act like this dude overall is similar to a Floyd Mayweather Jr. or like a Aristani Lara, like one of the fighters. Now, of course, Lara was not American. He was Cuban. But, you know, it is what it is. Basically, the point that they're trying to make is that Canelo Alvarez mainly has problems overall with black fighters. Well, Canelo Alvarez has had problems with a multitude of fighters. Now, the fighter overall that he's had always the most amount of trouble with was obviously Floyd Mayweather Jr. And, of course, he had a lot of problems against Lara. He also had a lot of problems against Golovkin. He also had a lot of problems against Sergey Kovalev. So it's not just American black fighters, or even black fighters in general, that Canelo Alvarez has had problems with. He's had a problem with a couple of styles. But it has been shown in the past, even recently, that, you know, when you like to be on the back foot and you're, you know, responsible defensively, when it comes down to it, you know, and you're a little bit slippery, Canelo may have a little bit of problems with you. Even Billy Joe Saunders showed that a little bit in the last fight, even though I thought Canelo Alvarez was winning the fight even before the knockout. But when it comes down to it, yes, you can give Canelo Alvarez a little bit of problems with that style. But my point being is this: Jermall Charlo, I don't understand this narrative where people overall say that he's just this slick fighter, because Jermall Charlo, he's never been that guy. People try to act like this dude is like a Terrence Crawford or something like that. Jermall Charlo, what he is a Danny Garcia type of fighter. He fights exactly like Danny Garcia in a lot of his fights. That's who Jermall Charlo is. He's not a Floyd Mayweather Jr. He's not an Aristani Lara. He's not even a Demetrius Andrade. He's none of those guys. He cannot fight the way that those guys fight. He cannot fight the way that those guys fight. And this is why I keep overall mentioning this, you know, narrative overall that these guys try to spread. Jermall Charlo and Demetrius Andrade, they're really not that much higher, if really higher at all, than some of the fighters that Canelo Alvarez is facing. They're pretty much on that same level as a Billy Joe Saunders, as a Caleb Plant, as a David Benavidez. There really is no major difference between any of those fighters. I have a certain amount of people that always try to point out to me, well, you're wrong, Billy Joe Saunders, did you see his performance against Akavov? Blah, 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 blah. Did you see this guy's performance? Did you see this guy's performance? I've seen a lot of these guys' performance for many years because I've been watching all of them for years. And I know all their faults. I know all their strengths when it comes down to it. And just like I also said with my last Demetrius Andrade fight prediction, I was right on the money with it. I predicted overall that he was going to have some problems with Liam Williams. And when it came down to it, I had some people that came in the comment section and said, I don't know how you can say these things about Demetrius Andrade. He always shows off, very impressive, yada, 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 yada. Then it came to the fight with Liam Williams, and what happened? He ended up being in trouble a multitude of times in that fight. Why is that? Why did I know that was going to happen? Because I know who Demetrius Andrade is as a fighter. I know what I'm watching when I watch Demetrius Andrade, just like I know what I'm watching when I watch Jermall Charlo, David Benavidez, Billy Joe Saunders, Caleb Plant. I know what I'm watching when it comes to all these fighters. All right? And in my opinion, is Jermall Charlo in a much higher class than any of those fighters? Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
You that to Montiel. Montiel did good in this fight. And you got to remember, Montiel is very powerful. You know, he's a very hard puncher. All of his wins was by knockout.
That's great, Dante, but you're kind of sugarcoating it with Jermall Charlo a little bit right now. I'm wondering overall, had this been Caleb Plant, because we all know Canelo is trying to get in the ring with Caleb Plant next. I wonder overall what the review would be. Do you think Dante overall would say, well, Juan Montiel, he kind of learned from getting knocked out in the past, or do you think that he would just trash Caleb Plant? I mean, even Caleb Plant, when when he fought Jose Uzcategui, Dante still tried to trash Caleb Plant overall, and that was when Jose Uzcategui was a very impressive fighter, when he, I believe, knocked out Andre Durrell, you know? So it is what it is. But then what did he say about Caleb Plant when he defeated him? Oh, well, or at least now that Canelo Alvarez has him in his sights, what does he say? Oh, well, Caleb Plant, he looked good in the first part of the fight, but he actually wears down in the second half part of the fight when it comes down to it. Now, if that had been Jermall Charlo against Jose Uzcategui, and overall he wore down, what would he have said? He would have said overall that Jermall Charlo had the most impressive performance of his career. That's what he would say. Anyway.
So he has a 100%.
But now it's interesting. Now that Jermall Charlo, once again, he has this little bad performance, all of a sudden he seems to be backing away from that prediction of Jermall Charlo beating Canelo. I just find that interesting because Canelo has kind of said recently, within the past few months, that he does have an interest in Charlo. So if I maybe would have a prediction, I think that, they may think overall that this fight actually will happen soon, and they're not too comfortable with their prediction of Jermall Charlo beating Canelo Alvarez anymore. To be honest with you, I'm not sure if they were ever serious about that in the first place. But it is what it is.
Knockout ratio. And even though he got rocked a lot of times in this fight, he found ways to survive, and he would rally back. And there were a couple times where it looked like he...
At Brakes Plus, we do it all, from alignments and oil changes to shocks and struts. We'll guide you through the repair.
He possibly hurt Jermall Charlo. So the bad news for Jermall Charlo was this was his worst performance, hands down. Matter of fact,
I'm not sure if this was his worst performance, hands down, because the Matt Korobov and the Austin Trout fights, those were actually pretty bad performances as well. So I'm not sure, because to be quite honest with you, yeah, sure, Jermall Charlo, he may have got hit a decent amount in the second half of this fight, but Jermall Charlo also clearly won this fight. Jermall Charlo was actually fighting, in my opinion, a lot smarter in those other two fights, and he still was clearly losing a lot of those rounds. So I can't say that this is the worst performance of his career. I would say overall that this was probably the dumbest fight that Jermall Charlo has ever fought in his career. That's what I would say.
Performance against Montiel makes the Korobov performance look like a good performance by Jermall Charlo.
I can't agree with that one. that was not a good fight by Jermall Charlo at all. Anyway.
That's how bad this one was. So that's the bad news. But the good news is...
Matt Korobov, by the way, who's a B-class fighter, because I've had some of these Jermall Charlo fanboys that come into the comment section and try to convince me that Matt Korobov, that he's this elite dude. Matt Korobov is a dude that even before the injuries started ruining his career, Matt Korobov is a guy that ended up getting knocked out by Andy Lee. All right, where he was the favorite against Andy Lee, and Andy Lee ended up knocking him out. Would you consider Andy Lee an A-grade fighter? You tell me.
Canelo Alvarez is always fighting guys coming off of their worst performances, right?
Using that narrative once again, that has been proven false, but it is what it is. When we take a look at Canelo Alvarez overall actually fighting fighters, I mean, just to list overall a certain amount of his opponents, he fought Erislandy Lara right after Erislandy Lara dominated Austin Trout. That was Erislandy Lara. That still to this day is Erislandy Lara's best performance of his career. When it comes down to it, that's when he fought Erislandy Lara. He fought Miguel Cotto when Miguel Cotto, I believe, was on a 3-fight winning streak and had looked completely revived with Freddie Roach. In fact, actually, Dante, I remember you predicting, and this was, of course, this was several years ago, but when it came down to it, I remember you predicting Miguel Cotto to win that fight. And all of a sudden, when it's time for you to try and tear down Canelo Alvarez, all of a sudden you want to pretend like at the time that wasn't a 50-50 fight. Was Miguel Cotto older and smaller naturally than Canelo Alvarez? Sure he was, but Miguel Cotto overall still was a very decent boxer at the time. Let's not pretend overall that, Miguel Cotto was some bum at the time. All right? It is what it is. Canelo completely outperformed him. He fought Billy Joe Saunders when Billy Joe Saunders completely shut out Martin Murray. Even though a lot of people want to try and say that that was an unimpressive performance, here's actually the facts of the situation. Billy Joe Saunders looked more impressive against Martin Murray than what Jermall Charlo and Demetrius Andrade looked in their last fights. That's the facts when it comes down to it, all right? So it is what it is. He fought Sergey Kovalev when he was coming off of a 2-fight win streak, knocked out the undefeated Anthony Yarde. Now, to be fair, Sergey Kovalev did look vulnerable in a couple of those rounds against Anthony Yarde. In fact, there was even one round where a lot of people thought he was getting close to getting knocked out. But besides that one round, Sergey Kovalev pretty much dominated the whole fight, and he eventually came back to stop Anthony Yarde. So let's not sit here and pretend that every opponent that Canelo Alvarez has fought has always came off of weak performances, because really, actually, when we talk about the majority of the time, that's not the case. Gennady Golovkin also, for example, was looked at as the most dominant middleweight in the world. When we talk about Danny Jacobs was coming off of a little bit of a shaky performance against Sergey Derevyanchenko, but come to figure out, Sergey Derevyanchenko, he's not going to beat any A-class fighters, but he's at least going to give those A-class fighters a solid fight, usually, when it comes down to it. All right? It is what it is. So he beat Danny Jacobs coming off of the Sergey Derevyanchenko win when it came down to it. He also fought Callum Smith when he was undefeated. He fought Callum Smith when he was undefeated, and he fought Callum Smith when he was the Ring Magazine champion, I believe, of that division. All right, and he knocked George Groves out not too long ago. So it is what it is. Anyway, so miss me with all that, Canelo only fights people at their worst. That's a bunch of bullshit. It is what it is. Anyway. Let's also not forget he fought Austin Trout, and Austin Trout was undefeated and coming off of a win against Miguel Cotto. At least I believe that's when he fought him. Anyway.
There's a better chance that now Jermall Charlo can actually get a Canelo Alvarez fight. So since this was a bad performance by Jermall Charlo, you Canelo Alvarez fans, you should be all on Canelo's Instagram, his Twitter, wherever, pushing him to take this fight, because this is what Canelo does. He fights guys coming off of their worst performances.
No, he doesn't, but that's been a lie overall that has been spread by you. Once again, to try and tear down Canelo Alvarez because you don't like either a Caucasian or really anyone else besides a black fighter, a black American fighter to be specific, as the number one pound-for-pound fighter. So it is what it is. Anyway.
Right? I mean, I can tell you right now, that Jermall Charlo that I just seen would actually lose to a Canelo Alvarez.
I hate to tell you this, Dante, and I think even you believe this too. I don't care if it's the best version of Jermall Charlo. I don't care if it's the Jermall Charlo that I've seen against Sergey Derevyanchenko, who looked a little bit improved than overall what he usually does. Even if that Jermall Charlo goes into the ring against Canelo, Jermall Charlo is not going to defeat Canelo Alvarez. I just don't see it. Now, if I end up being wrong, I'll eat my crow. I have no problem admitting when I'm wrong. But when it comes down to it overall, I just don't see it, man. I personally don't see how Charlo beats Canelo. Once again, I don't see Charlo beating him in any category besides height and reach. Besides those two categories, I don't see any other category that he beats Canelo Alvarez in. Not hand speed, not head movement, not defense, not counterpunching ability, not power, nothing. The only things he has over Canelo is his height and hand reach. And it's not that big of a difference overall, especially with Jermall Charlo's type of style. I don't think that it's going to be that big of a difference or that big of a deal breaker for Canelo. I think Canelo's going to go in there. I think overall that Jermall Charlo is going to be very surprised at the power and at the counterpunching ability and at the accuracy of Canelo Alvarez. And I think he's going to be very surprised at the power that Canelo Alvarez has in his punches. And I think he's going to be backing up early. And I think Canelo probably is going to walk him down. I'm not going to say that he stops Jermall Charlo. But of course, I also predicted that he wouldn't stop Billy Joe Saunders. Now that was a little bit unlucky that he broke his orbital eye bone. But, it's possible. Canelo does have enough power to stop Jermall Charlo. I would just say overall that it probably is more than likely can happen by decision. But we'll have to see what happens with that.
But we have to see if this was just a bad performance, or is this the new version of Jermall Charlo that we're going to always see?
What do you mean the new version, Dante? What do you mean the new version? Jermall Charlo, according to you, is supposed to be one of these slicksters, like a Floyd Mayweather Jr., like an Erislandy Lara, like one of these other guys. How come all of a sudden you're predicting that Jermall Charlo, that we might see him fight like this from now on? How come overall this is not just an outlier performance when it comes down to it? Once again, I find that interesting. That tells me that Dante, I'm not really sure how much confidence he's really ever had in Jermall Charlo in beating Canelo Alvarez, because once again, he has one slightly bad performance, and all of a sudden you're getting off the train completely? Interesting.
We don't know. It could possibly be.
I mean, how many fighters in the past overall have had an iffy performance against a fighter, and then when they fought the A-class fighter, they actually looked a lot better when it came down to it? You know, we can take a look at Tyson Fury, for example. He had a very iffy performance against Otto Wallin, who turned out actually to be a very decent boxer. I'm not saying overall that Otto Wallin is like top 5 or anything, but he could be a future top 10 guy at least. So Otto Wallin, actually, he was kind of a diamond in the rough a little bit when it came down to it, and Fury was very fortunate to get out of that fight without the fight being stopped because of that cut. And he just won by narrow decision, I believe. But when it came down to it, then he fought the rematch with Deontay Wilder. Now, going into that fight, Dante, you thought that it was a 50-50 fight. Why would you not say that Deontay Wilder would crush Tyson Fury because of that unfortunate, fight against Otto Wallin? Because, well, is this the Tyson Fury that we're going to see from now on? Once again, why would you say, and he doesn't even like Tyson Fury. Jermall Charlo is a guy that he's been trying to protect really for years upon years upon years. Why all of a sudden would you say that, well, is this the Charlo that we're going to see from now on? If Charlo is supposed to be the creme de la creme, meaning overall that he's so far ahead of everybody else, also Demetrius Andrade apparently is in that category. If you think they're the creme de la creme, and overall that they can be the guys to possibly beat Canelo Alvarez, why would you assume that Jermall Charlo is going to look like this in every fight from now on? There's always a bunch of boxers, even the best of boxers, that may have an unimpressive performance here and there. All of a sudden you assume that Jermall Charlo might fight like this from now on? Interesting.
He just, the styles, him underestimating Montiel. Once again, Montiel was very powerful. And
so you think that he possibly underestimated Montiel, as do I. So you even said it yourself. You believe that Montiel possibly was underestimated by Jermall Charlo. But you're worried that Jermall Charlo, that he's going to go into the Canelo Alvarez fight possibly and fight the exact same way. I got you. When it comes down to, once again, that tells me overall that something is going on here. That tells me overall that you never have really had as much confidence in Jermall Charlo as you've really been letting on. But it is what it is. Anyway.
Funny thing I thought is when Montiel was moving around the ring, he was actually more dangerous because you got a guy who's moving around and you never know when he's going to throw a punch, and this guy has a high knockout ratio, a very high knockout ratio. It wasn't until he came forward where he kind of started making it a little bit easier for Jermall. But later on in the fight, all of a sudden it looked like all those punches, that record that he broke, Jermall Charlo, actually is what possibly gassed him out, throwing all those punches.
I agree as well. And to be honest, maybe that may be why Jermall Charlo don't let his hands go more often. Maybe he cannot throw combinations upon combinations. Maybe we'll see. Now, maybe, I'm not sure if the record broke, if it was just the record that, the most amount of punches that he's ever thrown in a fight, or if it was a record, breaking, including a multitude of fighters. I'm not sure. But, I'd have to look at it.
While he was throwing all those punches, during the second half of the fight, a lot of times Montiel was walking him back. He was kind of walking him down. And he was landing some good body shots. They both were, but Montiel was there.
Once again, I've always said this as well about Jermall Charlo. He can be a decently accurate puncher, but he's not as accurate as he thinks he is. Okay? It is what it is. Anyway.
Definitely landing some good body shots and head shots on Jermall Charlo. Now listen, I know Canelo Alvarez is trying to unify all the belts at 168. He wants to fight Caleb Plant next.
Who is an infinitely more dangerous fighter, in my opinion, to Canelo Alvarez than what Jermall Charlo is. And a lot of people overall are going to disagree with that. Let me tell you something. If Caleb Plant and Jermall Charlo, if they were to fight right now, I think Caleb Plant, not only would he beat Jermall Charlo, I think he'd absolutely embarrass him. I think he would absolutely embarrass Jermall Charlo. That's what I personally believe. If David Benavidez fought Jermall Charlo, that would still be a 50-50 fight in my opinion, because Jermall Charlo, he does have a lot of power, and David Benavidez, he is a good pressure fighter. He would give Jermall Charlo a lot of problems probably, but he does get hit a little bit too often. So that would be a very interesting fight. But like I said though, this is my opinion about Jermall Charlo. When we talk about him, at least versus the best version of these guys, if the best version of Demetrius Andrade goes in there against him, the best version of Billy Joe Saunders goes in there against him, the best version of David Benavidez, the best version of Caleb Plant, I'm not sure if he beats any of those guys, man. Like, I'm serious. I'm not sure if he beats any of those guys. But it is what it is. Anyway.
Assuming he gets that fight or he doesn't get that fight, Canelo Alvarez would be a fool not to take the Jermall Charlo after that performance. Because
I personally believe, if you had to ask me, I believe that Canelo Alvarez is personally going to target Jermall Charlo for his next fight after he faces Caleb Plant. That's what I believe is going to happen. But we'll see, because Jermall Charlo, he's probably going to take another fight after that. Apparently, he wanted to unified middleweight. I know that that's a load of shit when it comes down to it, so we're not going to see that fight. But especially if Jermall Charlo feels like he's going to get Canelo Alvarez sometime within the next year. So we'll see what happens with that. He'll probably face another B and C class fighter, and then hopefully they can get the Jermall Charlo versus Canelo Alvarez fight going. But we'll see what happens.
you obviously want to be the first man to beat whoever is undefeated. Someone who's been chasing Canelo for 6 years, you know what I'm saying? This is the man that forced Canelo Alvarez to vacate his belt at 160 and retreat to 168, where the champions are easier to beat and it's easier to become undisputed.
That's not really true, because Billy Joe Saunders and Caleb Plant, they're really on the same level as Demetrius Andrade and Jermall Charlo. And once again, a certain amount of people will disagree with me. Go ahead and take a look at them in their last fights. That's all I'm going to say. I have a certain amount of these people that always tell me that, Billy Joe Saunders, he's had certain unimpressive performances, and Caleb Plant, that he kind of wore down against Jose Uzcategui. Once again, go ahead and take a look at Demetrius Andrade versus Jack Colque. Go ahead and take a look at Demetrius Andrade versus Liam Williams. Go ahead and take a look at Demetrius Andrade against Vaders Martirosyan. When you see him, have fights with certain fighters that give him problems, all right, he does not look levels above these guys. Now, in my opinion, would Demetrius Andrade possibly beat a Billy Joe Saunders and a Jermall Charlo? If you're talking about him at his best, do I think that he's a little bit better than those two fighters? Yeah, personally, I do. But when it comes down to the overall, I also believe that Caleb Plant, personally, is at his peak, is better than the rest of those guys as well. That also includes David Benavidez, by the way. But it is what it is. Anyway, David Benavidez, out of that whole entire pack, he might be in second or third place when it comes down to it. Because I'm not sure if either Demetrius Andrade or Jermall Charlo would defeat David Benavidez. That's actually a fighter that they should be trying to go after, especially Demetrius Andrade, since he seems to be having this problem getting big fights. I would love to see Demetrius Andrade go up to 168 and challenge David Benavidez, because I promise you, if he was able to defeat a David Benavidez, especially convincingly, but even not convincingly, if he was able to defeat a David Benavidez, overall, he would very much get a lot of the attention, probably of the Mexican-American fans and a lot of boxing fans out there.
This is Canelo's perfect opportunity to go after Charlo. Once again, assuming he either gets past Caleb Plant or the fight doesn't happen. It would make absolutely no sense for you to allow someone else, like a Montiel, or some other no-name fighter, someone who doesn't have a big name, to go in there and beat a Jermall Charlo.
What do you mean overall someone with a no-name, Dante? That's a pretty big statement you just said right there. Someone like a Montiel or another no-name fighter, not a big-name fighter that may defeat Jermall Charlo. All of a sudden, we went from this spectrum to where Jermall Charlo once upon a time would beat Canelo Alvarez, or he's the biggest threat to Canelo Alvarez, to all of a sudden Jermall Charlo, he may not even beat a B-class fighter in his next fight. Interesting.
You want a win like that on your resume, especially if Canelo Alvarez could beat a Jermall Charlo with no controversy.
It wouldn't be any controversy, Dante. At least not in my opinion. I don't see I don't see how Jermall Charlo beats a Canelo Alvarez. I just don't see it, because once again, besides height and reach, there's really nothing that Jermall Charlo beats Canelo Alvarez. Just nothing. He doesn't beat him in power. He doesn't beat him in speed. He doesn't beat him in combination punching. He doesn't beat him overall in counter punching ability. He doesn't beat him in head movement. He doesn't beat him overall with ring generalship. He doesn't beat him in defensive ability and defensive responsibility. There's almost nothing that Jermall Charlo, out of the 20 possible categories that we can judge by, Charlo might have one or two of those categories in his pocket. I don't see him beating Canelo Alvarez. I never have. I've never seen that, in a million years. I've just personally never seen it. Now, once again, I would be a fool to say that Jermall Charlo has absolutely no chance because he is a decent fighter and you never know what's going to happen. But that being said, I think that his chances are very slim. I give him, at most, a 20% chance of beating Canelo. And that's always the chance that I've given him. But it is what it is. Anyway.
Now, once again, I don't know if Canelo can beat him, but I know...
Oh, I can tell you he certainly can, Dante. I'll tell you that. I'll tell you that much. He certainly can, and you certainly seem to think overall that he can in this video. Anyway.
Once again, that version of Jermall Charlo, if Canelo Alvarez was able to walk down Jermall Charlo and do what Montiel was able to do, he would beat him. But styles make fights. And once again, this is why the fights have to happen.
Not only that, but you never know when a fighter overall may have an off performance one day, and then the next day overall, they may look very sharp. It all depends on the opponent. It all depends on the day. Certain people can just have off days. And maybe Jermall Charlo, maybe he just had an off day. But all of a sudden, you seem to think that Jermall Charlo, that he's just nowhere near the same fighter. And all of a sudden, well, you know what? Canelo might win against Jermall Charlo. To me, this is basically Dante admitting that I don't think Jermall Charlo is going to beat Canelo. And this is really his way of saying that if Canelo does face him next and beat him next or beats him within the next couple of fights, I'm just going to say overall that Jermall Charlo was not the same fighter. That's really all he's going to say. But it is what it is.
We don't know how these fights are going to play out until we watch them. Because no one expected Charlo versus Montiel to go the distance.
I agree with you, Dante, and that's why when it comes to your pound-for-pound list and a certain amount of these other LDBC and new media pound-for-pound lists, you can't have these certain people who have not defeated the A-class fighters on your pound-for-pound list. You can't have Jermall Charlo on your pound-for-pound list when he's only a two-weight division champion and he's defeated a total amount of 0 A-class fighters in his career. You can't have someone like a Devin Haney who's fought very low-tier competition and have him on your top 10 pound-for-pound list. All right? The only fighter that I think I have on my pound-for-pound list that has repeatedly fought, somewhat of low-tier competition, the only one that I have on my pound-for-pound list overall that has fought somewhat low-tier competition is Naoya Inoue, because he's been so dominant within a few weight divisions. But when it comes down to it, you notice that I have him pretty low on my pound-for-pound list. But I can't have someone like a Jermall Charlo, I can't have someone overall like a Devin Haney on my pound-for-pound list when they've not defeated anybody. That's just the bottom line. It is what it is.
And be a competitive fight.
And overall, they don't have the work in the divisions, or they're not as dominant as, say, like a Terrence Crawford. Because Terrence Crawford, he's in my top 4 pound-for-pound, at least when it comes down to it. He's a very great fighter, when it comes down to it, even though he hasn't faced that top-tier competition. But Terrence Crawford is at least somewhat special in some regard because he's unified a complete division, even if you want to say the division was not that competitive when it comes down to it. But, he's a 3-weight division champion. He at least has defeated a couple of decent fighters, one in Victor Postol and Yuriorkis Gamboa. I'm not sure if you would argue that either of them are A-class, but you could. There's really no fighter on Jermall Charlo's resume that I can say, wow, they're really A-class.
That's why we have to have the fights. So there's a very good chance that when Charlo, or if Charlo gets an opportunity to fight Canelo, we're going to see a sharp Charlo. We're not going to see this version of Charlo.
Okay, so you think exactly the same way that I think overall about Jermall Charlo. So Dante, why are you saying all these things overall that, well, Jermall Charlo, we need to see overall if this is going to be him from now on, or, if this is just a one-time thing? You seem to be pretty stressed out after this performance. Once again, I thought Jermall Charlo was supposed to be the creme de la creme. This is interesting. Anyway.
Right? So that's why the fights have to happen. And you guys keep hearing me talking about how Canelo could possibly beat Charlo because he can.
He probably can and he probably will. I would be let me say this. I would be shell-shocked if Jermall Charlo got in there and beat Canelo Alvarez. That's my personal opinion. In fact, to be quite honest with you, I'd be pretty shocked if any of these 160 or 168 pounders beat Canelo. I'm not betting on any of them to beat Canelo because Canelo, he's just a different type of fighter. But it is what it is. The only fighters that I think actually have a legitimate chance of possibly beating Canelo at their best would either be Artur Beterbiev or Dimitri Bivol. Those would be the only ones. Maybe Caleb Plant might stand a chance, but I don't think that, even though I think that he does have a good skill set, I don't think that he has enough to beat Canelo. But we'll see what happens.
At the same time, if we get the version of Charlo that knocked out Julian J. Rock Williams, there's a possibility he can win as well. But at the end of the day,
I hate to tell you this, Dante, that version of Jermall Charlo, that's not even the most impressive performance that he has in his career. That's just the best opponent that he's ever beaten in his career. For those of you that don't remember, go ahead and rewatch the fight. Jermall Charlo was losing a few of the rounds in that fight. Jermall Charlo was getting hit up by J. Rock Williams in a couple of those rounds. You can see right there that he don't have A-grade head movement. Once again, I know what I'm watching when it comes to Jermall Charlo. And for anyone overall with a logical and sound mind that knows anything about boxing, they know what they're watching when it comes to Jermall Charlo. It's not that hard to figure out. Jermall Charlo is a very decent fighter, but he's not this slickster that a lot of people try to allege that he is. Once again, he is a Danny Garcia type of fighter. He fights actually very, very much like a Danny Garcia. That's what he is. Anyway.
hey, I don't care if it was a foregone conclusion that Canelo will win the fight. We still have to see the fights to really see, who is the best from one.
I agree with that because you never know exactly what's going to happen with the fight. I do agree with you there, Dante. Very well said.
60 to 168. Jermall Charlo and Demetrius Andrade.
Welcome to the future of home internet. Delivered by 5G Ultra Wideband, the fastest 5G in the world. Free from annual contracts and wires too. This is the home internet that changes everything. Verizon 5G Home.
Are the same thing to Canelo that Tank Davis and Devin Haney is to a Teofimo Lopez. The only difference.
No, not really. When it comes down to it, and Dante, if you knew a little bit more about boxing, you probably would know that because that's really not that good of a comparison. Because when we talk about Gervonta Tank Davis versus Teofimo Lopez, I would probably favor Gervonta Tank Davis in that fight. That's a completely different fight than what Jermall Charlo versus Canelo Alvarez is. When it comes down to it, that's a completely different fight because Teofimo Lopez versus Gervonta Tank Davis, that's a 50-50 fight. Teofimo Lopez versus Devin Haney, you could also argue, especially after Devin Haney's most recent performance, because I thought he looked very, very sharp. I thought that was the most impressive performance of his career, even if it may not be against an A-grade fighter at the current time. But when it comes down to it overall, he looked very, very good. You can argue that Devin Haney and Gervonta Tank Davis are humongous threats to Teofimo Lopez. I don't think that anyone with a logical and sound mind would argue that Demetrius Andrade and Jermall Charlo are anywhere near as big a threats to Canelo Alvarez as what Gervonta Tank Davis and what Devin Haney are to Teofimo Lopez. But it is what it is. Anyway.
Difference is Andrade and Charlo have been chasing Canelo for almost 7 years now. So yeah.
Yes, Jermall Charlo has allegedly been chasing all these guys for several years. And then when it actually came to these guys calling out his bluff, all of a sudden, Jermall Charlo, he's not a 168-pounder. Why does he got to face those guys? All this sort of shit when it comes down to it. We'll see what happens. I do believe that Jermall Charlo, when the time comes, though, he'll probably take on the Canelo Alvarez fight because why wouldn't you? It's basically a win-win situation for Charlo. Even if he does get his ass kicked, that's a great payday when it comes down to it. And if you beat Canelo, you're on top of the world. So it is what it is. Anyway.
It would be really foolish for Canelo Alvarez to give someone else an opportunity to become the first person to beat Charlo.
Right, but who is going to defeat Charlo, Dante? Is it going to be an A-grade fighter, or is it going to be one of these B and C class fighters overall that you're alleging might beat Charlo? You don't seem very impressed with Charlo after that fight, which I get to a certain degree. But you would think overall, with the way Dante's been talking about Jermall Charlo, you would think overall that this would be no big deal when it comes down to it. Now, why all of a sudden has his opinion changed to Jermall Charlo? Because Canelo may fight Jermall Charlo within the next year. And all of a sudden, he seems to be putting his coins in another area. But we'll see what happens.
After the Caleb Plant fight, There are no other options for Canelo, at least no real options, except for David Benavidez, Demetrius Andrade, and Jermall Charlo. Those are the only fights that will make sense after Canelo gets past Caleb Plant, or if that fight doesn't happen, right? Now, I wouldn't be surprised if Canelo, he surprises everyone and goes after Gabe Rosado, but no one really wants.
Yes, he's going to go after Gabe Rosado, who has 13 losses in his career. Yes, I see that happening very much. Like, come on, Dante.
To see that fight. These are the fights that people want to see. On top of that, Charlo is a huge draw. He's a huge draw in Texas. We know.
That is true, and I think Canelo Alvarez knows that. I think Canelo Alvarez, I think overall that he actually is very interested in a Jermall Charlo fight right after he unifies that 168-pound division. He has expressed a lot of interest in Jermall Charlo, really within the past few months especially. It sounds like Canelo does want that Jermall Charlo fight. We'll see what happens.
Canelo with the Mexican fan base in Texas, and the fact that Jermall Charlo can fill up an arena in Texas, that alone tells us he's a big draw. But let's also not forget that when Jermall Charlo and his brother, Jermall, when they fought on the same cards, they did like some of the biggest views of the year. Matter of fact, that card I'm referring to, when Charlo fought Harrison, Jermall fought Harrison, and Jermall fought Korobov. That was like the biggest card.
Yes, where Jermall in the first fight lost to Tony Harrison, and no, it was not a robbery. And that is a big part of the reason why Jermall Charlo also is not on my top 10 pound-for-pound list, even though you could debate him there if you wanted to, because Jermall has almost unified the whole entire division. And even though I wouldn't say that there's any clear A-class fighters there, it is at least very talented with a lot of solid B-class fighters. Jermall Charlo certainly would at least be in my top 15 pound-for-pound, no doubt about it. I just don't know if I can put him in my top 10 pound-for-pound, because when we talk about that final five, which is where he would be on my pound-for-pound list if I were to put him on there, I'm not sure if I can put him above a Josh Taylor. I would not personally. I don't know if I can put him above an Iowa Inoue, and I've never had the biggest opinion of Iowa Inoue's competition, but he is one of the more dominant fighters out there. I'm not sure if I can put him above an Anthony Joshua, who I personally have on my pound-for-pound list. I'm also not sure if I can put him above a Manny Pacquiao, who would be around number 6 on my list, and I'm not sure if I can put him above, one of the other fighters that I have on there. Can't really remember at the moment. But that might have been 5 fighters that I just listed right there. Anyway.
One of the biggest cards of the year in terms of revenue and TV ratings, right? So it makes all the sense in the world. So there's no reason for Canelo not to take this fight. I mean, if you Canelo Alvarez fans truly believe that Canelo completely washes Jermall Charlo, you felt that same way when Canelo was going to fight Rocky Fielding, right? You felt that same way when Canelo was going to fight Smith. Unless you're going to tell us.
Smith overall, once again, a lot of these people like to shit-talk Smith and act like he was some bum. No, Liam Smith was a bum. Callum Smith overall is not no bum. Callum Smith was a Ring Magazine champion. And let me tell you something, Dante. If Jermall Charlo, if he got in the ring with Callum Smith, let me tell you something. He might have a little bit of trouble. Because Callum Smith, he's not just some pushover. That dude's a very tall, very lengthy, very decently powerful, good fighter. I'm not saying that, he's on the same level as some of those other guys, maybe like a Billy Joe Saunders or like a Jermall Charlo. But he's tougher than you think.
That you think or you thought Rocky Fielding had a chance to beat Canelo. We know that's not the case. So the question is simple. If you knew Canelo was going to beat these guys easy going in, then why hasn't Canelo fought Jermall Charlo? When you also say, let you tell it, you believe Canelo beats him easy.
I do think he beats him easy. And once again, I'm not a fan of any of these fighters. I'm not a Canelo Alvarez fan, but I do have a great amount of respect for Canelo because I do believe he is the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter. I believe that he embarrasses Charlo. But that's my opinion. We'll see what happens.
Apparently, Canelo hasn't felt that way. He might feel a little different after watching this performance because, once again, this is usually when Canelo licks his chops.
Well, once again, like I said, I counted that in the video, but anyway.
When he sees extreme flaws, when he sees a poor performance.
Well, if that's the case then, and if Canelo Alvarez truly is scared of Charlo and he does that with every fighter, he should have fought Jermall Charlo right after the Matt Korobov performance, or right after the Austin Trout performance, or right after the Brandon Adams performance. Because once again, people try to act like Jermall Charlo has never had an unimpressive performance before. This dude has had like several unimpressive performances in his career. I don't know what the hell people are talking about when it comes to Jermall Charlo. Even Demetrius Andrade has had a couple of unimpressive performances in his career. You know, like once again, the Demetrius Andrade fan base, they'll try to tell you overall that Demetrius Andrade overall, you know, he's gonna completely outbox Canelo. Now, does Demetrius Andrade have more of a chance, in my opinion, than Charlo? Yes, he does. But you can tell the way that Demetrius Andrade fights, he just has too many flaws. It is what it is.
That's usually when he changes his tune. This is exactly what Canelo did with Billy Joe Saunders. When Billy Joe Saunders looked sensational against David Lemieux, Canelo said, "I don't like his style." That's exactly what he said.
That is true. He did say that, but after Billy Joe Saunders looked very impressive against Martin Murray, he fought him anyway. It is what it is. Anyway.
He said, I'm not interested in that fight. I don't like his style. Then all of a sudden, BJ, he looks horrible in his last two performances.
No, he didn't look horrible, but that's the narrative overall that what the Canelo Alvarez detractors have tried to say. It is what it is. Billy Joe Saunders did not look horrible in his last fight against Martin Murray before he fought Canelo. In fact, he looked much more impressive against Martin Murray in his last fight than what Demetrius Andrade or Jermall Charlo have looked like in their last fights. And that's the facts. It is what it is.
And Canelo, he starts licking his chops, and he says, I want that. I want that Billy Joe Saunders now. Right? Let's see what he says about Charlo after this performance. That's all I got for now, guys. I'm on to the next one. Now check this out, guys. If you're looking to repair
Anyway, that's really about it for today. I just thought that it was interesting how Dante, all of a sudden, he doesn't seem to have the same amount of confidence in Jermall Charlo. And don't get it wrong when it comes down to it. You know, Dante, he's not going to give Canelo Alvarez that much props if he does defeat Charlo, which he will if that fight does happen, because I don't see how Jermall Charlo beats Canelo Alvarez in this world anyway. But when it comes down to the overall, bottom line is this. I just find it interesting because Dante, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, he seems to have nowhere near the same amount of confidence as he once did. You would think overall that if you truly think that Jermall Charlo is this A-grade fighter, or the creme de la creme, 100%, that one little shaky performance really wouldn't detract you that much from your opinion. But all of a sudden, he's saying, well, Jermall Charlo, we might see this Jermall Charlo a lot from now on. That's interesting. Why would you assume that? If you believe that Jermall Charlo is, an incarnation or a reincarnation of Floyd Mayweather, or, those slick type of fighters. I just found that interesting. Anyways, thank you all so much for watching. That's pretty much about it for today. We'll see what happens. I do believe that this Jermall Charlo versus Canelo Alvarez fight, if Canelo was able to get past Caleb Plant, which in my opinion he probably will be able to do, if he's able to get past Caleb Plant, I believe that the Jermall Charlo fight is probably going to happen after that, or soon after that. So we'll see when it happens. Anyways, that's really about it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.